This is the story of Air Transat Flight 961. The planes we fly on are modern marvels, made up of literally thousands and thousands of parts, all working in unison to keep you in the air. It's a miracle of engineering if you think about it, but on the flip side, if things were to go wrong, the smallest thing could snowball into a major issue. So thousands of designers spent hours and weeks thinking of ways to make each and every part of an airplane that much less prone to failure. But as you already know, some flaws still slip through the cracks. Air Transat Flight 961 was an Airbus A310, was a flight from Juan Gilberto Gomez Airport in Cuba to Jean Lesage Airport in Quebec, Canada, on the 6th of March 2005. A long flight that would take it along the entire east coast of the North American continent. The plane left Cuba at 2:48 a.m. in the morning, and it was cleared up to 35,000 feet. The plane was settling in for its long cruise as it made its way north towards Canada. At 3:02 a.m., a loud bang rocks the airplane. I imagine that the sleeping passengers were shaken awake and that they must have been scared. The plane that they were flying on was shaking violently, and it was the dead of night. The shaking was so violent that the flight attendants were thrown to the floor and unsecured carts rolled through the aisle. The plane started to Dutch roll. A Dutch roll is a combination of a roll and a yaw, and is induced when erroneous yaw inputs are sent to the flight computer. The pilot, seeing that the plane was in danger, disconnects the autopilot and hand flies the airplane. The plane was climbing and they were at flight level 359. The pilots got the plane under control and they brought the plane down to its designated altitude. The pilots tried furiously to diagnose the issue, but the plane's ECAM, or Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitor System, doesn't have any warnings or action messages that would help them deal with the situation. Even more strangely, the cockpit was quiet, no alarms blaring, no nothing. If a pilot were to walk in at this time, they'd suspect that nothing was wrong with the airplane, but the airplane was damaged. To what extent, they didn't know. They were having a hard time controlling the airplane. She was feeling sluggish and slow to respond. The crew guessed that a lower altitude might help them stabilize the plane. The thicker air at a lower altitude might give them more control authority over the airplane. The pilots wondered if the plane's yaw dampers had failed. Yaw dampers are like autopilots for controlling the yaw of a plane, and yaw dampers are critical in countering a Dutch roll. Both yaw damper switches were engaged, but the plane was still having issues. Could there have been a double yaw damper failure? Had both yaw dampers failed, they'd know about it on the ECAM system and the autopilot would have disconnected. As they descended, they decided to divert to Fort Lauderdale in Florida. The plane was now down to 28,000 feet and she was more controllable. The pilots asked the cabin crew to prepare the cabin for an emergency landing. They'd have to be prepared for anything. They didn't know how badly their plane was damaged or how it would handle at low altitudes or low speeds. The crew continued their descent down to 10,000 feet. The captain now handed the plane over to the first officer as the captain briefed the flight director. The captain contacted dispatch. Dispatch wants them to turn back to Varadero, the city that they took off from. Juan Gilberto Gomez Airport was better equipped to handle the plane and the passengers, so they abandoned their approach to Fort Lauderdale and climbed back up to 19,000 feet for the short hop back to Varadero. The plane was stable and was flying relatively stable. The crew even turned the autopilot back on as they flew towards Varadero. They disabled the autopilot as they approached Varadero. The plane was ready to land on runway 06 at Varadero, and she was slow to respond to control inputs. The pilots coaxed the stricken plane back onto the runway at Varadero. The plane landed safely, and their ordeal was at an end. The pilots now got their first look at the damage. The rudder was missing. The rudder, it looks like, had been ripped from the vertical stabilizer. Losing critical control surfaces can be disastrous. Planes can literally drop from the sky if something as critical as the rudder or the vertical stabilizer were to fail. American Airlines Flight 587 crashed for precisely this reason. Aggressive rudder inputs ripped the vertical stabilizer right off the plane, causing it to plunge from the sky. Investigators had the tough job of finding out what had happened with Air Transat Flight 961. Much of the rudder disintegrated over the ocean, and all the pieces sank to the bottom, never to be recovered again. The investigators had to go off of the bits and pieces that were attached to the rudder to help them piece together what had happened. The investigators performed a lot of tests on the tail, from chemical ones to load-bearing ones. The tail of the A310 is made up of multiple layers of material, all squished and bonded together. After multiple flights, the material in the tail started to come apart, which the report calls a disbond. This was essentially metal fatigue, but for the tail. Plane manufacturers have learned how to deal with metal fatigue. Airplane skins are designed to limit how far cracks can spread, but the tail had no such mechanism. The disbond grew over the course of multiple flights, and on March 6, the faults just grew too big and the rudder failed. Once the cracks were large enough, the cracks grew quickly, which caused the catastrophic failure of the tail. The failure of the rudder probably put the rest of the tail under intense structural loads. The loads on the tail worsened as more and more pieces of the rudder broke away. At the end of the initial separation event, only 16% of rudder functionality was left, and that number was going down. As the plane flew, more bits of the rudder fell off. When the plane did land, it was essentially missing a rudder. Small, simple, unnoticed cracks in the tail almost cost 271 people their lives. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. A big thank you to my Lost Airplane fan for letting me use his amazing videos on my video. I'll catch you guys next time.